Right now, you are the only kind of human on Earth. Not just the dominant kind, not just the most successful kind, the only kind. Every human being alive, 8 billion of them, belongs to exactly one species, Homo sapiens. That is it. That is the entire list. But it was not always like that. For most of the last several 100,000 years, our species shared this planet with other humans. Not distant cousins, not early ancestors. Other humans. Beings who walked upright, used fire, made tools, hunted large animals, cared for their injured, and in some cases, buried their dead. Beings who, if you dressed one in modern clothing and put them on a subway, you might not immediately clock as anything other than a stranger with an unusual bone structure. They are gone now. And the question of why the real why, not the oversimplified version, is one of the most contested and fascinating open questions in all of science. Here's the version you probably learned at some point. Homo sapiens arrived. We were smarter. We won. Everyone else lost. The end. That version is not just incomplete. It is wrong in almost every direction it can be wrong. Let's start over. Roughly 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appeared in Africa. But Africa was not waiting for us. Other human species were already well established. And beyond Africa, the situation was even more crowded. Neanderthals had been living across Europe and Western Asia for at least 400,000 years before the first Homo sapiens arrived in those regions. They had been there for longer than our entire species has existed. They knew those environments intimately. They had survived ice ages, multiple ones. In Asia, the picture gets stranger. A group called the Denisovans, named after the Siberian cave, where their remains were first identified, lived across a wide range that may have extended from Siberia down into Southeast Asia. We know about them not from skulls or skeletons, but primarily from DNA, ancient DNA extracted from a finger bone, a tooth, a jaw fragment. That is nearly all we have. And yet from that tiny sample, geneticists have reconstructed an entire branch of human evolution that nobody knew existed before 2010. Here is the part nobody puts in the textbook. At certain points in prehistoric history, you could theoretically have walked from Africa across into Europe and encountered Neanderthals, then crossed into Central Asia and encountered Denisovans. And in the very same period, in parts of Indonesia and the Philippines, smaller hominin species Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis were also alive. Multiple human lineages. One planet. Sharing territory, sharing prey, sharing whatever the prehistoric world had to offer. And then the map goes dark, one species at a time. So what happened? Let's focus on Neanderthals, because they represent the biggest challenge to any simple explanation. Neanderthals had brains that were, on average, as large as ours, sometimes slightly larger. They made sophisticated stone tools, the Mousterian toolkit that required planning, skill, and teaching. They controlled fire, they hunted large prey, including woolly mammoths and bison, which is not a casual activity. They used pigments, possibly for body decoration, they crafted ornaments, they transported raw materials over significant distances. They apparently cared for individuals who were too injured or elderly to care for themselves, because archaeologists have found Neanderthal skeletons showing healed injuries that would have required months of support from others to survive. Some Neanderthal sites show evidence of intentional burial. The evidence is debated, but it is there. These were not slow, dim-witted creatures waiting to be replaced by something cleverer. They were humans living successful lives in one of the most demanding environments our genus has ever occupied. So why aren't there Neanderthal cities today? The honest answer is, we do not fully know. Researchers have been debating this for decades. The disappearance of Neanderthals is not a solved problem. It is an active scientific argument, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you a cleaner story than the evidence supports. What we do have is a set of plausible contributing factors, and the word contributing is doing important work in that sentence, because no single factor is sufficient on its own. The period during which Neanderthals disappeared, roughly 40 to 45,000 years ago, was not a stable, pleasant time to exist in Europe. Climate during the late Pleistocene was not simply cold. It was violently unstable. Rapid oscillations between warmer and colder periods, some happening over timescales of decades rather than centuries, repeatedly disrupted ecosystems across Europe. Forests expanded and contracted. Prey animal populations collapsed and recovered. Habitats that had supported populations for thousands of years became uninhabitable within a generation. For a species already living in relatively small, fragmented populations across a large landscape, which is what Neanderthals appear to have been, this kind of instability is not just uncomfortable, it is existentially dangerous. Small populations are vulnerable in ways that large populations populations are not. A local disaster that kills 30% of a group of 50 people can end that group entirely. The same disaster killing 30% of a group of 5,000 is devastating, but survivable. Population size is not just a number, it is a buffer. And Neanderthal populations, based on current genetic and archaeological evidence, may have been relatively small and fragmented across much of their range. But here is where it gets complicated, because Homo sapiens were arriving into Europe at roughly the same time the climate was destabilizing and Neanderthal populations were under pressure. That is probably not a coincidence. Some researchers have proposed that one of Homo sapiens' key advantages was not any individual capability, but something more structural: the size and connectivity of our social networks. Here is why this matters. A tool does not need to be invented by every individual who uses it. Knowledge can travel. A better hunting technique developed by one group can spread to neighboring groups. An innovation in clothing, or food processing, or hafting a tool, these ideas can cross hundreds of kilometers through trade, exchange, and contact between connected populations. The faster information moves, the faster it can be tested, refined, and improved. Cultural knowledge compounds. And if Homo sapiens populations were, in at least some regions, larger or more connected than Neanderthal populations, then their cultural knowledge may have accumulated faster, not because any individual Homo sapiens was more creative, but because there were simply more minds in the network. This concept, cumulative culture, the idea that human knowledge builds on itself across generations, is considered one of the most significant factors in human cognitive evolution. And the speed of cumulative culture depends heavily on how many people are connected to each other. This is not a comfortable narrative for those who want a simple "we were smarter" story, because it suggests the difference may have been partly structural and demographic rather than purely intellectual. Neanderthals almost certainly had cultural transmission. They had social groups. They taught skills. The difference may have been a matter of degree, of scale, of how interconnected those groups were across geographic space. When Homo sapiens entered Europe, they brought a distinctly different technological package: blade-based stone tool technology, bone and antler tools, sewing needles, which implies tailored clothing, which implies significantly better cold weather protection, evidence of fishing, long-distance transport of specific raw materials, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from their source, symbolic objects, beads, carved figures, musical instruments. Now, a critical point: Neanderthals also had technology, sophisticated technology. There is evidence of Neanderthals using adhesives to mount stone tools, evidence of them collecting shells and marine materials for possible ornamental use, evidence of symbolic behavior predating the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe by tens of thousands of years. The question is not whether Neanderthals had culture and technology. They did. The question is whether Homo sapiens had advantages in how quickly they could develop new technologies and spread them across large geographic areas, whether their toolkit was more flexible and adaptable to rapidly changing environments, whether they could afford to experiment with new approaches because their larger networks provided a buffer against the failures that experimentation inevitably produces. What happens to a species living close to its survival margins when the environment suddenly changes? If you cannot adapt fast enough, if your population is small and fragmented, and your cultural knowledge travels slowly, the consequences can be catastrophic before a solution is found. And now the part of this story that genuinely rewrites everything. We did not simply replace Neanderthals. We met them. We spent time with them. And the evidence for this is sitting inside your DNA right now. Genetic analysis of modern human populations outside Africa consistently shows approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal ancestry. The interbreeding events that produced this ancestry are estimated to have occurred primarily in the Middle East, and possibly across Europe, during the period when Homo sapiens first expanded out of Africa into Neanderthal territory. This was not a single event. Researchers have identified evidence for multiple interbreeding episodes across different time periods and geographic regions. And Neanderthals are not the only story. Some populations in Oceania, particularly Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians, carry Denisovan ancestry. Genetic traces of Denisovan DNA have also been identified in certain East Asian and South Asian populations. A small number of individuals tested have shown genetic signals suggesting interbreeding with an archaic human population that hasn't even been formally identified yet. Use the branching tree analogy carefully. Human evolution was not a single trunk growing upward. hard. It was a complex network of branches, some going extinct, some merging, some splitting apart again. Some of those other branches were not cut off completely. They were grafted in, which means the question, why are we the only humans left, has a genuinely surprising component to its answer. In a meaningful genetic sense, we are not entirely alone. Parts of those other populations persist inside us. When researchers study the Neanderthal genetic material in modern humans, they find genes that are still actively contributing to modern biology genes involved in immune function, metabolism, and adaptation to particular climates and UV light levels. The Neanderthals contributed something to our survival. Their genes, arriving through interbreeding, may have provided Homo sapiens expanding into Europe with adaptations that Neanderthals had spent hundreds of thousands of years developing for exactly those environments. They are gone as a distinct species, but they are not entirely gone. There is one more factor that needs to be addressed carefully, because the evidence is limited and the territory is sensitive. Did Homo sapiens directly contribute to the disappearance of other human groups? Competition for resources between expanding Homo sapiens populations and established Neanderthal groups seems likely in at least some contexts. When two groups need the same prey animals in the same territory during a period of environmental stress, the interaction is rarely neutral. Demographic competition where one population simply grows faster and gradually displaces another by occupying the same resources more effectively does not require intentional violence to have devastating effects. Direct violent conflict is possible. It cannot be ruled out, but it also cannot be assumed universally from the available evidence. The picture was probably different in different places, at different times, in different environmental conditions. Disease has also been proposed as a factor. Homo sapiens arriving from Africa and the Middle East would have carried pathogens that Neanderthal immune systems had not encountered. This kind of exposure asymmetry has had devastating consequences in more recent human history and is biologically plausible as a contributing factor in prehistoric encounters. The evidence for it is indirect and difficult to confirm from the fossil record. What is clear is this: the disappearance of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other archaic human populations was not a simple clean event. It was a slow, messy, geographically variable process that played out differently in different places over thousands of years, driven by a combination of factors that researchers are still working to disentangle. Pull all of it together, and the honest answer looks something like this. Homo sapiens probably did not survive because we were definitively superior to every other human species in every meaningful way. We survived, and they did not through a combination that included demographic advantages in at least some regions, more extensively connected social networks that allowed cultural knowledge to accumulate and spread faster, technological flexibility that may have allowed more rapid adaptation to environmental instability. A diet broad enough to sustain populations across radically different environments. Interbreeding that introduced useful genetic variants from populations already adapted to local conditions. And an element of chance that is uncomfortable to acknowledge, but almost certainly real. Evolution was not building toward us. It was not running a race with a predetermined winner. It was maintaining multiple parallel experiments simultaneously in different environments. And then the experiments ended, one by one, for reasons that are still being worked out. We are what is left. Not the final version of humanity, not the best one, the last one standing from a much larger set of options that the planet was running simultaneously for hundreds of thousands of years. And here is the part that should stay with you. We like to frame survival as a kind of victory. The best competitor won. The superior model replaced the inferior ones. But population replacement and absorption and extinction do not work that way. They are not sporting competitions with clear winners and fair rules. They are messy, slow, often brutal processes driven by circumstances that the individuals involved had no control over. The Neanderthals, who interbred with Homo sapiens tens of thousands of years ago, did not know they were contributing DNA to billions of future humans. The last surviving Neanderthal population, wherever and whenever it finally ended, did not know it was the last. We are the species that survived. We carry pieces of the ones that did not. And if another human species were still alive today, different skull, different posture, different cultural tradition, different way of seeing the same world, would we share the planet with them the way we failed to before? That question does not have an answer, but it is worth sitting with. Leave your answer in the comments.